Hi, I'm Jessica Sipovic, Training Specialist with the Illinois Center for Transition and Work with the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. In today's webinar, we are going to discuss transition plan development, focusing really specifically on writing and aligning post-secondary and annual goals. Some of the things we're going to talk about is transition planning as being the heart of the IEP. We all know this as transition-focused practitioners, how important the transition plan is in regards to kind of putting a focus on the IEP and the development of the entire document. We're going to dive into writing post-secondary goals, more about what they are, how we make sure they're compliant and measurable, looking at industry standards and career awareness as part of our kind of guiding light with the development of these, and the formula we should be using when putting these together for our students. Then we'll also talk about the annual transition goals. What are those? How do we develop those using the SMART goal template, and making sure that we're putting them together in a formula that's meaningful and measurable. And then we're also thinking about the triangulation of goals, the alignment of these annual goals with post-secondary goals and other components of the IEP. And then we'll talk about some additional resources that are available on the ICTW website. So this might look really familiar because if you are a teacher that's written an IEP, you should be very familiar with the components that are listed here. This is what's required of a transition plan in the state of Illinois per the school code and indicator 13. We're going to focus on two of the parts, the two that I've already mentioned, as well as the two that are in blue here on this list. We're going to discuss the post-secondary goals that we develop in the areas of employment, education training, and independent living. Those are that need to be updated on an annual basis. We're also going to talk about, like I mentioned, the coordinated measurable annual IEP goals that will reasonably enable the student to meet their post-secondary goals. And then some of the other things that go into this that are not mutually exclusive of these two things, but we're not going to be able to dive into that today, is the post-secondary goals and how they need to be based on age-appropriate transition assessment. Lots of resources on that in our website if you need more tools in your toolbox. Thinking about transition services and the coordinated set of activities, the kind of who does what and who's doing what activities throughout the year to move that student a little bit closer towards their post-secondary goals. Another required component of transition planning in the state of Illinois is making sure that we have a course of study that facilitates the student's movement to post-school goals. So really being intentional about the programming and courses that our students are taking throughout their time at our schools. Student involvement is a really, really important piece of transition planning and the preparation for what life looks like after graduation, self-determination, self-advocacy, those skills, their voice being heard and written in throughout the IEP and the actual meeting itself. And then finally, and not by any means least, the coordination and linkage with post-secondary activities and services, how we're looking beyond the school building and what's out there in the community and bridging the gap between school and community resources, because we all know that school is going to end at some point for our students, whether that's at 18 or 22, whatever makes the most sense for that particular student. Those services are what picks up where we left off. So making sure that our families and students are connected and they know what's available to them out there and they know how to advocate for the supports and services that they need. All right, so let's dig in. We're going to talk about first post-secondary goals. So what are they? A post-secondary goal is generally understood to refer to those goals that a child hopes to achieve after leaving secondary school. A post-secondary goal is not the process of pursuing or moving toward the desired outcome. So these are what are the big hopes and dreams rooted in assessment data, rooted in student skill, ability, and interest that they are striving for after they leave us. So it's not about what's going to happen this summer or next semester or an internship they're going to do. It's what that kind of big beefy, pie in the sky vision for the future we have for that particular student. We know that these need to be written in a way that one's compliant, meaning in alignment with indicator 13 requirements, and that we can measure it. We know that it happened or didn't happen, that we're moving towards something that is tangible. That all needs to be kind of based in assessment data. We don't just kind of make these things up. We talk to the students, we talk to their families, we talk to the professionals that interact with that student. Could be related service providers, paraprofessionals, whoever's kind of on that student's team, if you will, to really understand what their desired outcomes are for after and what that will occur after they leave high school. So we're using the words will in these statements, and sometimes that can make us a little uncomfortable, but we're talking about setting our vision and making this happen. So student will be employed full-time, student will attend community college, student will live on his own, maybe not. But these are exactly, we need to state them in a very clear and measurable way. This is a formula that has been tried and true in my personal experience with years of transition plan development myself, as well as an administrator overseeing transition plan compliance for my previous school district. So we want to be really clear. This is a kind of a fill in the blank. Once you have all that assessment data, we start with after high school, upon completion of high school, after receiving certification of completion, the student, make sure you put their name, will, a measurable verb, work, obtain, apply, practice, complete, build, create, construct, prepare, select, measure, choose. Oh, so many beautiful options, whatever makes the most sense for your student. This is not an exhaustive list, so feel free to come up with some other ones that you like. And then one identified outcome. We understand that students have lots of big hopes and dreams, so we do have to start to funnel this into something really specific so we can drive the IEP towards that. It's okay to do exploration and look into other things, but really choosing one identified post-secondary outcome that they're striving for in whatever area you're developing this goal for. So, like we mentioned before, post-secondary goals need to be developed in 3 different areas. The first one, the one that we spend so much time talking about here at the Illinois Center for Transition and Work, is post-secondary employment. So here's an example. After graduation from high school, student will obtain, what kind of employment are we moving towards? Are we talking about full-on competitive employment? Are we talking about supported employment, customized employment? Whatever makes the most sense for the student. We understand that not every student is going to work in full-time and in a competitive space. They might be supported forever in a part-time kind of component, but it all should be paid employment in the community as much as possible. Post-secondary independent living is another area in which these post-secondary goals need to be developed. So upon completion of high school, student will, and again, this isn't just about the physical structure in which they're going to live in, house, apartment, condo, whatever that looks like, but really thinking about what sort of independent skill are they going to master to be as independent as possible within the space that they are living. If they're going to live at home or with a family member, and that's the plan, awesome. But how are they going to make sure that they have a voice and they are as independent as possible in that space after they graduate from high school and as they matriculate through adulthood? And then the other areas we talked about: post-secondary employment, independent living. The third one is kind of an and or, a slash. It's post-secondary education and or training. That's how the law is written. So we're picking whatever one or both that makes the most sense in alignment with that student's post-secondary employment goal, right? So we know that to obtain certain types of employment, or really all employment, there needs to be some sort of preparation. We don't just go in cold with no experience, training, or understanding of a job and just get that job and be successful at it. So thinking about what sort of either formalized education or training is going to be needed for the student to be successful in their post-secondary employment plan. So if that includes a job that requires an associate's degree or higher, meaning, like I said, a 2 or 4 year degree, it could even mean a master's or a PhD. But if they're going to be obtaining one of those, we're talking about a formal education outcome. If that is not what's going to make the most sense or not required for the job that the student is going to be wanting to obtain after graduation, then we can talk about training. And training can be a standalone goal where we're talking about, it could be on the job, skills training. It could be a trade or apprenticeship kind of program, a certain certification or licensure. There's lots of things that could set a student up for success, but everyone's going to require some sort of training and or education to be successful in that next step, whatever that next employment place looks like. So we're going to use an example of a student named Lissette throughout this webinar today, just to kind of illustrate some potential goals that we could develop. So let's meet Lissette. She's a 20-year-old student with Down syndrome and scoliosis. She's identified on her IEP as having a moderate intellectual disability. She does use a cane and AT devices due to some mobility and communication struggles. She is taking occupational course of study where she's really focused on those transition skills because she is 20 years old. She's in that transition program. She's in a separate setting, so she doesn't take classes with non-disabled peers. And she does receive a modified curriculum for those classes. Currently, she's in a STEP internship. So she's working at a pretzel maker, a pretzel shop at the local mall. So that's her current internship place. Wonderfully so, that's aligned with her career interest. She does want to be a prep chef. So she does want to work in a restaurant or a kitchen of some variety. She also has aspirations to attend community college at some point. We know that that is not necessarily required to be a prep chef, but that's something on her personal interests. And the assessments that were conducted to gather all of this information, because we know all of this needs to start with assessments, is we did the WISC, the PICS career interest survey, and student and parent interviews to better understand the current levels and where the student is currently and where they desire to be after graduation. All right, so an example for Lissette. So after high school, Lissette will work part-time at the community college food court with job coaching support. So that is her post-secondary employment goal. It's in alignment with her, her goal of being, like we said, she wants to be a prep chef. She wants to be in that community college environment. Perfect. And she's going to need a job coach. Great. Let's call that out in the goal. So we are very aware of what that looks like. For her education and training, Lissette will participate in workforce development program at her community college and will obtain a food service certificate. We know that that is some workplaces, especially in kind of a cafeteria, kind of a more corporate setting, they are going to require those food service certifications. And there's a kind of a series of them. But this is something that can be obtained at most community colleges. This is a great next step that will really open up some job opportunities for her in the future. And then as far as her independent living goal, Lissette will, after high school, Lissette will use public transportation to safely navigate throughout her community, including travel to her schooling and employment at the community college. Fabulous. So we know that all of these are coming together, thinking about not just where is she going to live, but what skills does she need to be as independent as possible? And her being able to independently travel to and from school, her community college, and her job is going to be such a wonderful step towards independence for Lissette. Something that comes up kind of often, and I alluded to it earlier, but sometimes we get a little uncomfortable with putting statements in our IEP that are out of the control of us as service providers. I cannot guarantee that my student is going to get a job in the future after they've graduated, right? That is not something that I personally can control, Jessica, as the teacher of this student. So the question comes up, if the post-secondary goals are stated as measurable outcomes that will occur after students have left the LEA, the school district, are there liability issues for the school when students don't meet those stated outcomes after school? Okay, that is the question that's being asked here. And the answer that comes to us from NTACT, as far as how we can kind of construct our thought around this, is that IDEA, which governs what goes into our IEPs, does not require that the schools are held accountable for the attainment of the post-secondary goals, okay? We are required to make sure that we are developing measurable goals for our students and that they are part of the transition plan. So we really need to think about how we are developing the goals and that we are setting our students up for success as we help them build their skill and development towards those goals. There are a lot of things that could come into play that could impact a student's ability to obtain a particular job. They might change their mind. Who knows? Again, things that are completely out of our control. We're responsible for us as special education teachers, as other service providers, as community rehab partners. The important part is that we are responsible for providing the educational programs, experiences, and services that's outlined in the IEP to set them up towards that. We are not responsible for them actually obtaining those goals after graduation. Of course, that's what we want, but if something changes or something impacts that, there's no transition police coming to your door and giving you a citation for not getting the students that particular job. It's really about the work that goes in on the day-to-day in the school building and the development of that transition plan and IEP to make sure we did our due diligence in making a really meaningful assessment-driven transition plan. And then what happens after graduation is just a little bit out of our hands, but we hope that the plan was set up as meaningful as possible, so it's easy as possible for the students to move on to that next step. Another thing that kind of comes up when we're developing the post-secondary goals is sort of making sure that we're rooting our goals in reality. Okay, we're making sure they are realistic goals that our students can actually obtain. Kind of alluding to that previous question about, are we responsible for what happens after graduation? No, but we are responsible for what is in these transition plans and these IEPs and how they are developed. So how do we kind of take our students and our families have really, really big, beautiful dreams for their students, but they might not necessarily be realistic and obtainable for that particular student, which is where we lean on what the industry requires of particular jobs. We cannot change the requirements and make modifications or accommodations to some degree for what is required in this example to be a doctor or play in the NBA or be a fighter pilot. These are things that we can't change. There's regulatory bodies that control a lot of the things that happen in these particular jobs for good reason. And we cannot change those things. So writing a transition plan for Lissette saying she's going to become a doctor is not going to set her up for success because it's not a realistic next step for her based on her skills and abilities. So we want to use what the industry requires of those particular jobs to help kind of root these in reality and guide the conversations around setting realistic post-secondary goals for our students. This is where career awareness is so important. Understanding, not just because I saw it on TV and it looks cool, or my aunt does it and she's got lots of money, so I want the same job she has, but it's so important that we're thinking about, okay, what is this job? What do you like about this job? Let's look at what the requirements are. Let's look at the education requirements. Let's look at the testing. Let's look at the physical endurance that you might need to have to do particular jobs and think, is that really aligned with what I want to do day in and day out for the rest of my life? So exposure and exploration and awareness is the key part that we can really fold into the transition plan to think about how are we exposing them and helping them really dig into what is required of these jobs. So again, something that I would say, we are not experts on every job on the planet. We didn't go to school to do that, but we are good at going on the internet, right? So one of the tools that I utilize a ton and I think helped me better understand careers. This might not be accessible for every student just to log in and look at on their own, but it's good for you to do some legwork and better understand the careers. And you can, help students and guide them through looking into the particular jobs and what is required. The career index is where I would send you, thecareerindex.com. The account is free. You just put in an email address, and it's very simple. It is nice because you can save kind of a portfolio, if you will, of things. But this is how you can kind of steer and look at maybe jobs that are related or jobs that have a similar interest that might not have the same amount of educational requirements or certification or testing. That might be a barrier for a student to obtain the job that they think they want, but through some exploration and inquiry, we can maybe look at jobs that are related or might be a better fit for their skills, abilities, and interests. All right, so we talked about post-secondary goals. Now we're going to jump into the annual transition goals. So although they're in a separate part of the IEP, our transition plan is developed. We started with assessments. We wrote these beautiful, individualized, measurable post-secondary goals for our students. And now we think about, okay, I know where they're going after graduation, but how am I going to help them move closer towards that? And that's where annual transition goals come into play. So the annual transition goal is representative of the next logical step for student growth based on the present level of performance. So just like any other goal, we use our PLAF, our present levels of academic and functional performance, in the transition or in the IEP annual goal section. We need to make sure that we're taking into account their past performance levels, their intellectual abilities, their functional abilities. All of those things come into play. And then that we measure chosen accurate, the measure that we choose, like how we're actually going to measure the attainability or of this goal, is chosen and accurately represents the educational objective. So those, if we're doing portfolio collection, it's something that has a tangible product. If we're doing observation or data tracking, that is something that you can easily gather that data on. We want to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we're measuring it and what the intent of this goal is. That we are focusing on the acquisition of a meaningful skill, again, aligned with that post-secondary goal that's already been written, and that this goal could be replicated in another setting or has transferability. We know generalization is such an important part of skill mastery for our students, and thinking about, can this be done in the school building? Can this be done out in the community? Can it be done at a grocery store? How are we taking these goals and thinking about how can they be applied in various environments and places? And also finally, that the benchmarks or objectives, whatever your district calls them, directly relate to the overall goal. So that those benchmarks are kind of little baby steps towards that annual goal. They're all in beautiful harmony to then also align with the post-secondary goals. So what does that look like? All right. So there's kind of two ways that these goals can be written. There's overlapping goals. Again, remember, you have to write 3 of these: employment, education/training, and independent living. So you can either write an overlapping goal that is an academic goal, can be also a transition goal if it's a relevant skill that aligns with the goals that are in their transition plan. So you should be, there might be times where you're like, okay, we're working on numeracy and computation in math class, and the student wants to work as a cashier in the retail environment. Awesome. These math skills are going to set the student up for success in this desire to be a cashier in a retail setting. We can thoughtfully align those two things, 2 birds, 1 stone, right? So we can thoughtfully align these two. We can overlap their transition goal of employment as a cashier, and their academic goal of building numeracy and computation skills. That is what we would call an overlapping goal. Not every goal works that way. So if we're realizing that, oh, this is just not coming together, we're, square peg, round hole, my transition goals and what they're working on in academic or other functional areas are not aligning, okay, then we have a standalone goal. It's a transition goal all on its own. It's very intentional, and it moves the student towards their post-secondary goal. And it's okay that they just stand on their own. Again, thinking about transferability of these goals, that can be conducted anywhere, not just in math class. It can be done in any environment. So what a wonderful opportunity to really dig into that particular skill or area of need. When we talk about goals just in general, we're always hearing about SMART goals, right? What is that SMART? Let's make sure it's in the SMART template. This is what we're talking about: being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic/relevant, and time limited. So we're thinking about, okay, what do we want to accomplish? Is it specific? How will you know when you've accomplished the goal? What's that measurement? Is it achievable? How can the goals be accomplished? Where can we actually make this happen? Are the goals worth working hard to accomplish? Is this a realistic and relevant thing that is worth the time and energy? Is this worthy of an actual goal? And can we accomplish this within the time allotted? Typically, it's the IEP year, right? That's not always an academic year. So sometimes that can be tricky. So is this a goal that's going to end at the end of this school year and we need another goal that starts next school year? Or is this something that can go throughout and be addressed regardless of the academic year it falls within? So here's kind of the structure that I've personally used, I've seen a lot of success with, and I think it helps to just kind of really define the different parts of the annual goal and really think intentionally about every component. Because I think sometimes we get used to writing goals a very certain way, especially with the academic goals, because we've written them a million times. But really thinking intentionally about how these goals are structured and what each and every part actually means and what that really looks like in reality. Writing the goal and implementing the goal need to make sense. They need to come together and need to be able to think about fully what the full development and implementation of this goal is going to look like. So we're going to talk about each of these components, but on an individual basis, but we're going to address, and you're going to see a color coding that's going to come through in quite a few different ways. So we're talking about time frame. Specify the time frame for the targeted goal. Strategies. What sort of supports or accommodations will you put in place to help the student reach their goal? The learner. That's the center of it all, right? Not just student, learner. Put that actual student's name. Behavior. What will a student actually do? What will I see with my eyes? Criteria. How are you measuring the student mastery of the goal? And then the condition, what is the actual tool that we're using to measure the progress? So we're going to talk about these a little bit more. But first, let me just illustrate this with an example. As you will see, same color codes as we just showed here, okay? So here's a goal for our friend Mariah. So by the end of the IEP year, that's our time frame, using a picture-based task list, our strategies, Mariah, the learner we're talking about, will independently complete 3-step work tasks, that's our behavior, at least 4 of 5 days out of the week at her community work site, our criteria, as measured by teacher data collection. That's our condition. Now, I'm going to read it again. Play along, close your eyes, and see if you can picture what this looks like in a classroom, okay? Because that's what we want. We want to be able to, this goal should illustrate exactly what we should see. If I were to walk into Mariah's class tomorrow, what I should see happening, okay? So play along, close your eyes, see if you can picture this. By the end of the IEP year, using a picture-based task list, Mariah will independently complete 3-step work tasks at least 4 of 5 days out of the week at her community work site, as measured by teacher data collection. I hope you can picture what this looks like. She's in her community work site. She's got 3-step tasks. She's got a picture-based task list, so she knows exactly what needs to happen. The teacher's observing, collecting some data on this. And I want to see this at least for the 5 days. Again, annually. Maybe we start with 2 of the 5 days, and then or 1, and then we lead to 2, and then 3, and build up from there to build her independence. But this is what we should be picturing and seeing when we walk into her classroom. All right, so let's kind of dig into these little components. Let's start with time frame. We're being specific about when this goal will be achieved by. I mentioned before, unfortunately, we all know our IEPs don't always just start on the first day of school. We're carrying them over from last school year. They happen on a random Tuesday in February, and that can be challenging from an implementation point of view, right? As a teacher, we want this to be as relevant to what's happening in the classroom, but we also need it to be as meaningful as possible when it comes to that student's movement towards their post-secondary goals. So thinking about, when is this goal going to be achieved by? If they're only going to be completing this internship through the end of the year, maybe this goal ends at the end of this year and we start a new goal for next year. But think about really when this time frame is in the goal will reasonably be achieved by. So we're talking about by the end of the IEP year, by the end of the IEP benchmark, by the end of the academic year. Think about what that looks like. We don't necessarily need to automatically say by the end of the IEP year, because that might not make sense for the programming that's available for that student. Strategies. Okay, thinking about what supports or accommodations will you put in place to help the student reach their goal? Okay, so how is the student being supported to meet this goal? Maybe they're giving the use of a graphic organizer or verbal prompts, teacher guided notes, a calculator, their AAC device, a picture schedule. Think about what sort of supports, either natural or created by you, are going to come into play to set this student up for success in this goal. The learner is the student's name. Again, not learner, student, scholar. We want to see the individualized name for the student that you created this plan for. So make sure that student's name is in there. Behavior. What will the student actually be doing? What is the task that's occurring? What are we measuring? What are we seeing with our eyes occurring? Okay. Are we following a 2-step procedure? Are we identifying materials needed to complete an assigned work task? Are they going to research careers within a specific career cluster of interest? Are they going to complete a 5-step task? Really thinking about what's the behavior we're targeting that is going to meaningfully move that student 1 step closer towards their post-secondary goal, but also thinking intentionally, how are you measuring this? We need to make sure that the measurement of the behavior is aligned with the behavior, okay? Like we mentioned before, we're going to talk about that right in a second here, but also thinking about what's the behavior and how can I measure that behavior, which is going to be really important. So the criteria is, how are you measuring the student mastery? When will we know that they did it, right? How will we know when we're reporting out on a quarterly basis, how close they are to getting towards that annual goal? So we're talking about a certain percentage of accuracy. Are we talking about a certain number of trials? Or are we talking about, like you said, with Lissette, Mariah's example, 4 to 5 days at their work site? What are we striving towards? What's the criteria of saying, yep, they got it, they're good, we can work on developing a different goal or building off of this goal for next year? All right, and then condition. Thinking about how we're measuring this. Are we looking at an observation log? Is there a teacher created rubric that's being utilized? Are the students creating some sort of tangible product that could be part of a portfolio collection? Is there a weekly checklist that we're utilizing? Is there another data collection tool that the teacher is using? But really thinking about what's that behavior and how can I gather progress from that? So is it something I see? Is it something I collect? Is it something I reflect on after? Really thinking about intentionally about how that goal is going to be measured and how you're going to be reporting out on that goal. I'm a very visual person, so I wanted to kind of show you what you'll see in other things as well is a triangulation of goals, really thinking about the intentionality of the goals, not just writing goals for goals' sake, but how are we writing goals that are intentionally aligned with our students' post-secondary goals, their current present levels, maybe potentially the academic standards that are aligned with that area, and how do we kind of bring all these things together? So here's our example. Upon high school graduation, student, again, we're going with a generic one, but we would want to use that student's name. We'll say Mariah here, will obtain employment as a restaurant line cook. That's her post-secondary goal. Okay, so now when digging into some of the skills that the student is still working on, and we know are going to be really important, the skill needed for the student to move to get to that post-secondary goal, one of them is going to be comprehension. Cooks need to understand orders and follow recipes to prepare dishes correctly. Okay, so thinking about that, we're aligning it with two things. One, the students' present levels and the academic standards. Awesome. So I'm going to jump to the student baseline right now, the PLAF. So currently, when given 10 common words used in cooking, like stir, preheat, boil, the student was only able to read and comprehend 2 of the 10 words. So there's a gap in that comprehension currently. We know they're going to be able to need to have a high level of comprehension when it comes to those cooking skills and terms. Currently, we're at 2 out of 10 words. We need to build that up. In alignment with the academic standards now, going over to the right there, we want to think about, okay, academically, in the requirements for the state of Illinois or Common Core, it is important that students are analyzing a complex set of ideas or sequence of events and explain how specific individuals, ideas, or events interact and develop over the course of the text. Beautiful academic and transition overlap opportunity there, right? The employment goal requires comprehension. We've got an academic standard that aligns beautifully with that. We know exactly based on assessment data where the student currently sits with that skill. So now we have an annual academic goal that is also a transition goal that's going to come together. So by the end of the IEP year, given visual supports and repetition, a student will read 8 out of 10 commonly used food words and explain their meanings as measured by data collection. I want to call out, this is not saying we'll read in English class only. This can occur in a career prep class. This can occur out in the community. This can occur at a internship. This could occur in English class. This could happen in the cafeteria at school. This could happen in so many different places. To the note before, thinking about not just what the goal is, but where the goal can be addressed. What a wonderful opportunity to really think about generalization and relatability of that skill. All right, so remembering our girl Lissette, right? She wants to work in as a prep chef. She's currently has an internship at the pretzel maker, right? She wants to get her food cert from the local community college. And working in the cafeteria at the community college and traveling independently, right? Those are the post-secondary goals and the things that we kind of already discussed earlier. So now let's look at examples of employment goals. Keeping note, we're using that same color code that we used before to kind of define the different components of the annual goal formula. So here's an annual goal example of employment for Lissette. By the completion of the current school year, again, not IEP year, by the end of the school year, given a cell phone with pertinent telephone numbers programmed and weekly practice in school and community settings, Lissette will successfully call or text her boss to communicate important messages in 5 out of 5 role play scenarios in school and community settings as measured by a teacher-created rubric. Fabulous. I can picture what this looks like. What a wonderful skill to think about. This is a part of employment that can really make or break an individual's success if they can communicate properly with their supervisor, their boss, their manager, whatever that might be. Role playing is such a wonderful training opportunity for students. Lovely goal. Okay, now annual goal, thinking about the education/training for Lissette, giving small group instruction on hand washing in food safety class, a task analysis, and self-monitoring sheet. So she's in food safety class. She's going to use a task analysis and a self-monitoring sheet. Lissette will demonstrate how to appropriately wash your hands with 100% accuracy, completing all steps in 5 out of 5 trials by the completion of the current school year, measured by portfolio collection. Wow. We know that hand washing in a kitchen environment has to be 100%, right? We can't half wash our hands and be successful in that training program because this is a food safety class, right? I love that we're looking at the self-monitoring sheet because there isn't always someone over your shoulder telling you did it right or wrong. So the portfolio collection is really going to show Lissette's ability to identify when she has washed her hands properly, and she's followed all the steps. Wonderful skill development and clear alignment with that post-secondary training goal that she has. All right, and finally, we have our independent living goal example for Lissette. So given the public bus schedule, adapted with pictures, Lissette will select the correct time and bus stop for 5 scenarios of activities presented to her with 95% or better accuracy by the completion of the current school year, measured by teacher observation log. All right, so again, very applicable, 5 different activities. So we're not just taking the same route back and forth. We're really thinking about different places she might want to go, what that looks like. And we obviously know that it's important to have good accuracy so we're not getting lost or turned around. So 95% seems probably really high if you're hearing that for the first time, but we want to make sure that these skills are things that students are able to do to high accuracy because they will be out in the community practicing these kinds of skills. All right. So we've talked about a lot, and I sure hope that it was helpful. Some of the things I want you to walk away with today. First and foremost, what you heard me say a million times, and we didn't talk a lot about assessments today because that's not what today was about, but everything we did talk about today had to have started with meaningful, age-appropriate transition assessments. You have to have the information first to be able to move towards developing post-secondary and annual goals. That's where we start. That's where all transition plan starts. So although we talked about goals today, I don't want to neglect the fact that those are an important part. We want to make sure that both post-secondary and annual transition goals are developed in the areas of employment, education/training, and independent living. All 3 areas, maybe 4 if it's both education and training, but at least all 3 areas for all students, regardless of disability. Post-secondary goals state the student's desired outcomes for what will occur after leaving high school. Again, we're focusing on the actual outcome, that future plan, and does not include the process of getting there. That's what other parts of the transition plan and IEP are for. So don't do too much in this section. Just think about that very clear one statement about what will occur after graduation in the areas of education, training, employment, and independent living. And when we're thinking about our measurable annual IEP goals, we're thinking about how we are reasonably enabling the students to meet the post-secondary goals, being super intentional with the alignment with the coordinated post-secondary goals. For writing an annual goal about post-secondary employment, it's aligned with our post-secondary goal and employment that we just wrote in the transition plan. And we want to make sure that they are based on student present levels of performance and ability. So we're using those industry standards, we're rooting them in where the students currently are and where they need to be in order to be successful in their post-secondary goals. I know this was a lot of information and I hope that it was helpful. If you want to see some of these resources that I've shared, we'll have live links and other resources particular to this webinar on our website. So if you go to ictw.illinois.edu, you'll be able to get the additional resources page from this training, but also lots of other topics. There's a lot of things that I touched on today: customized employment, those pathways towards employment, self-determination, transition assessment, work-based learning experiences. I hinted to all of these today. Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. These are all really important. These are some of the topics you'll see on our website. So I know that this is just one component of a big list of topics that are very valuable and important when it comes to transition plan development. So check out our website. Thank you so much for coming in and spending some time with me today to talk about goals. I hope you can tell I am enthused about IEP transition plan development, because I think it's just the cornerstone to meaningful transitions for students with disabilities. So thanks for joining us today, and I hope to see you at a future workshop or webinar. Thank you.